Hello everyone, Maria Young here from SHEP EarthAware, and from us all at SHEP and the Cork Environmental Forum, welcome to this webinar in our Fridays for Earth series. Now in our 10th webinar since we started this series. We'll have our first anniversary soon. For information about Cork Environmental Forum, go to cef.ie. And if you want to be put on the mailing list of SHEP EarthAware, email shepearthaware@gmail.com. We send out a newsletter every month. Both CEF and SHEP Aware are active on social media. So this month we are concentrating on climate change, and we recommended 2 documentaries for you to watch. An Inconvenient Truth, the first of the 2 Al Gore documentaries on climate change, and 2040, a relatively recent film. We will show a trailer of 2040 in a moment, just to refresh your memory. We're really delighted and honoured to have John Sweeney as our guest speaker this evening, along with Caitríona Courtney of the NCE Energy Hub in Cork City, and a young activist, Amy O'Brien from One Future. Our 3 guests will be formally introduced to you shortly. John will present for 30 minutes or so, and in a break with tradition, we will have a question and answer session immediately following John's talk. And we encourage you, the audience, to ask plenty of questions. And as usual, use the chat facility on Zoom. And for those of you not familiar with this, just take a look at your screen, click on the icon that says chat. A board will open up on your screen. You can type in your question and it will then be relayed to ourselves. We may not get to all the questions, but we will do our best, and we ask that you keep them relatively short. Following John, our moderator will introduce Amy and Caitríona, who will each give a 10-minute presentation, followed again by an opportunity for you to ask questions. Tonight's webinar is being recorded for archival purposes. None of the audience will appear in the recording. I want you to note a date as well in your diary, and that is Tuesday, April the 27th. The popular Greening Our City series continues at 2:30 p.m. with the session on donut economics titled Making City Growth Sustainable and Just, the Donut Economics Approach. And this will be presented by Dr. Declan Jordan of Cork University Business School. You can book it on Eventbrite. And now I'm going to present our moderator this evening. Rachel Power is a PR and communications professional specialising in climate change communications. She has managed PR campaigns in Ireland and Europe and led the communications team that helped return the Green Party to the Dáil in 2016. In her home city of Cork, she is chair of the Wilton Justice Group, which advocates for climate justice. Rachel is also a member of the Management Committee of Cork Environmental Forum. She's currently working in ocean energy research and studying for a master's degree in climate change, policy, media and society at Dublin City University. And speaking of Al Gore, it was watching his second documentary, An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, that inspired Rachel in 2018 to train with Al Gore to become a climate reality leader. And Rachel recently was appointed Volunteer National Coordinator for Climate Reality Europe, Team Ireland. Thank you. Enjoy this evening. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Maria, and welcome everybody. It's really lovely to see so many of you here this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce the guests on our panel discussion tonight. As Maria was saying, there'll be a slight change just for time purposes this evening, as John Sweeney has to leave a little early, and we thought it would be nice to have the opportunity to ask him questions at the end of his talk. So I'll introduce John first, and then Amy and Caitríona. Emeritus Professor John Sweeney has taught at Maynooth University Geography Department since 1978. He received his bachelor's and his PhD from Glasgow University, and his PhD was in the meteorology and climatology of air pollution. He's lectured at several universities in North America and Africa and has published over 100 scientific papers and several books on climatology and climate change, including some reports for the IPCC. He served as president of the Irish Meteorological Society, the Geographical Society of Ireland, and An Taisce. And in 2014, he was awarded the inaugural award for achievements in journalism from the European Meteorological Society. You'll probably know him already as he's a regular contributor on Irish media on climate change science. And we're delighted to have him join us tonight for his talk, which is entitled Climate Change, the Global and Local Situation. So if you'd like to take the screen, John, you're more than welcome.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I'll try and get my slideshow up here. Let's see if it works. Are we okay? Mm-hmm. Great, okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you this evening. I know probably some of you have heard my story before, and my condolences. You feel free to close your eyes and drowse off at any stage. But what I really wanted to talk to you is about two things, as you can see. One is, where are we at the moment in terms of the global aspects of climate change? And then a little at the end, where are we in terms of Ireland, in terms of how we're about to try and tackle this problem, this great problem of climate change. I know that, you know, when we talk about climate change now, it's very difficult for us to get away from this issue of COVID, and we've all been haunted by it for the past year or so. And we've been watching very closely every utterance that comes from the World Health Organization, and we've seen the cycle here of waves of the infection globally, which now accounts for about 2.87 million people as of yesterday. And I showed you it because I want to show you another statement from the World Health Organization as well. And that other statement oops, let me go back. That other statement is saying that between 2030 and 2050, that's only 9 years away, we expect climate change to cause approximately 250,000 deaths per year. So, you know, if you add that up over the 20 years, it's something that's worse than probably what we'll get by the end of the COVID emergency. You can see also from the map where those problems are largely going to arise, mainly in the developing countries, mainly in the global south. In other words, in places which have not caused the problem, but which are going to suffer most of the impacts from it. So I just wanted to start by reminding us, therefore, that while we think of, you know, the current crisis we're in, and while we maybe muse over what might happen once we sort this one out, at the back there is this other big looming problem that we can't really ignore, and we have to really take very seriously. So you're all very familiar with this kind of an animation which shows the way the world has warmed from the middle of the 20th century to the present time. And I show you it not because I know it's a hackneyed diagram, but because I want to make a couple of points about it. And the first one is that, you know, while we talk about global average warming or global warming, this, as with all averages, does disguise a great deal of inequalities, a great deal of difference. And in the case of this particular map, you'll see that, for example, there's a great difference between the oceans and the land, with the land warming significantly more than the oceans. So when we talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, it's worth remembering that we may be talking about much more than that over the land areas where people live, and the global average conceals a lot of that. The second thing, of course, is there's inequality, as you can see there, between parts of the globe itself, between the low latitudes, which warm a little less, and the high latitudes, especially in the northern hemisphere, which warm a great deal more. And that's something that we'll come back to in a moment. But we now know that as we sat in our houses for 2020, it was nevertheless the hottest year on record, joint hottest, I should say, tying with the record year of 2016. And indeed, you know, 19 of the 20 warmest years since thermometers became reliable have now occurred during the last 20 years. So quite exceptional circumstances. And we also know what's causing it. It's quite clear now that we are causing these problems as a result of what we're doing to the atmosphere. And I'm just going to show you this little animation and let it run through, because you can see that if we look at the way concentrations of carbon dioxide have changed, you can see way back in 1979, almost 50 years ago now, they were about 336 parts per million. Each of these dots, of course, is somewhere that was measuring the carbon dioxide concentration from the left here, the South Pole, to the right here, the North Pole. And you can see the way that that graph will go up as we work our way through time. You'll also see that, that graph also is reflecting a seasonal change, whereby concentrations go down during the summertime and up during the winter time. And that's because, of course, plants grow during the summertime and take the concentration of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to some extent. But the trend you can see there, well, it's quite a clear-cut trend. It's almost linear, in fact, if you look at the average there. And you can see by the time we get up to the turn of the century, we're now beginning to hit values of 380 parts per million. And I'll let that run through. You'll also be maybe a bit puzzled by the two sides of this graph. You can see how the left side, the southern hemisphere, is much more stable, whereas in the northern hemisphere, the stations go up and down a lot more. And that reflects also the fact that in the northern hemisphere, it's mostly land, and on land, plants grow. And so we get that seasonal cycle I mentioned enhanced, whereas in the southern hemisphere, well, it's mostly ocean. So we don't get the same oscillation between summer and winter. But you can see that by the time we get to a few years ago, we're up around 400. We're actually well above that now. And even if we push that record back a little, of course, we run out of stations to measure. We only had 1 or 2 key stations since the 1950s. And you can see the trend is the same. But if we push it back a little further using other ingenious techniques like analysis of trees and even later on of bubbles in the ice sheets, you can see a strange thing happens. It settles down at around 280 parts per million. And all the way back through human history, it doesn't get above that. Even when we push it back through the various ice ages and interglacials and go all the way back maybe to 500 to 800,000 years before the present, we get oscillations during interglacials and glacials, yes, but we don't get anything like what we've done to the atmosphere in the past century, in the past 50 years especially. So it's quite clear that we've caused an experiment on the atmosphere on a grand scale by changing the constituents of the atmosphere, and it's this which lies behind the warming that we've seen today. There's no doubt anymore, but for the first time in human history, it's us that are in charge of climate, not climate that determines our viability, as was the case with our great-grandparents and grandparents, who went out to save the hay, for example, and didn't always save the hay because they were at the mercy of climate and its vicissitudes. And when we look at where those concentrations are being emitted from, we can see once again that here we're looking at the big developed countries of the Northern Hemisphere, the North Americas, the Western Europes, the big developing countries of China, of Korea, of Japan. Here are the culprits. And you can see how little the contribution to their problem is being made by the developing countries of the global South. So we have this issue right away of climate justice coming to the fore, and climate justice, which I think we have to recognize as one of the major considerations we have to bear in mind, that we are part of the problem, but here is the main impacts being felt. Now, if you think this little island up here is immaterial, let me assure you that Ireland alone emits more greenhouse gases than the 400 million poorest people on the planet. And that's quite a sobering statistic in terms of responsibility. We can't see it, of course. We can't see greenhouse gases because they're colorless, and for the most part, they're odorless. But if we could capture a ton of carbon dioxide, it would look like this. And for everybody here tonight, we are responsible for about one of those balloons every month. That's our per capita emission rate in Ireland 12.2 tonnes per capita. We're the third worst in the EU because of that, and our emissions are 50% higher than the EU average. So we're back to this culpability issue, we're back to this problem issue. If we even could capture 1 day of those balloons being emitted, if you like, we would be able to pile them up here, as you can see on the entrance to Dublin Bay. There'd be 160,000 of them from 1 single day. So quite a considerable, if you like, imposition on the atmosphere is occurring as a result of human activity. And because of that, the Intergovernmental Panel can project from the models that we will face a rise in temperature over the next 20 years alone of around about ½ degree further in terms of our warming relative to the end of the last century, and that we are on track with only a 50% chance of avoiding a 4 degree warming on our current trajectory by the end of the current century. So that's the bad news, if you like, and of course you can see what it would do to that map earlier on I showed you. It would make many parts of the world very difficult indeed, especially in places like the Middle East, for adaptation, for human habitation, for outdoor work, for agriculture, and so on. So there's a bad situation if we don't tackle this problem. For rainfall, of course, we know that we haven't got that certainty that we have with temperature because rainfall is so variable. So what we can say generally is that we will see more intense and more extreme events in many parts of the world. And we will probably get more rain in places we don't want it and less rain in places where we could do with it. So it's a double-edged sword. Now this right away creates vulnerabilities. It creates vulnerabilities in 3 key areas. One, for example, the semi-arid parts of the world, the sub-Saharan parts of the world, where we know the way that the social fabric really gets under stress very quickly if the rains fail. Secondly, of course, we know there are places that live very close to sea level in the great atolls and low-lying islands of the world. And here we know that many hundreds of thousands of people live within a couple of meters of sea level and are very vulnerable to storm-driven surges and to rises in sea level in the future. And again, it's this question of morality, of ethics that we have to face up to, that, you know, these are people who do not necessarily contribute to their own problem, but we are the people who are causing their problem. And perhaps most vividly demonstrated in the great mega deltas of the world, the Nile, the Ganges, Brahmaputra here, where the land is actually subsiding due to the weight of sediment brought down by the rivers. So sea level rise is telescoping their problems into a much shorter time period. This is Bangladesh, where you can see how much of the land lies below about 5 meters above contemporary sea level. Just to put Ireland on for scale here, you can see it's maybe 2 or 3 times the size of Ireland. Big difference though, we've got 6 million people on this island, and in this country there are 160 million. So there's a right away a problem of where do these people go when their homeland is flooded. And we can begin to see how climate refugees are going to be a major problem, because even a 1 meter rise in sea level, which we expect to have by the end of the century, will displace maybe a quarter of that country to seawater. So right away we have these difficulties that we have to face up to in terms of how do we tackle this problem. As I said, we now know 2020 was the warmest year in record jointly with 2016, but you can see the trend is quite clear there as well, and it's already beginning to manifest itself in terms of extreme events. We saw what happened in Australia, what was happening in California. We've seen the destruction of the rainforest that's going on furiously at the moment. And these kind of things are accelerating the trend themselves towards greater warming. One of the most recent reports identified 2020 as a year when about half the size of Ireland in terms of pristine forest was lost through burning or being cut down. And that has been going on, unfortunately, reversing some good trends that were established in previous years, quietly and often politically motivated. A lot of forests are being lost. And if you look at what that means, For example, last year, it meant the release of 2.64 billion tons of CO2, which is about equivalent to the total emissions from the current members of the EU, but yeah, just slightly less than the current members of the EU and equivalent to a country the size of India. So things are happening. And the worry, of course, is that while they are happening, they may not be recoverable to the extent that even if we changed our ways, we might be able to recover lost ground. And this is what we refer to as tipping points. And here you can see the grey bar is showing you 1.5 to 2 degrees, the Paris range. And you can see how some things are already happening below that level. The coral reefs are beginning to go and may not be recoverable. The alpine glaciers are beginning to go and may not be recoverable if we get above 2 or 2.3 or 2.4. We're going to see, or we are seeing, the loss of summer sea ice, maybe even the beginnings of irrecoverable melting out of Greenland, which will take a long, long time. But once started, many of these things are not going to be capable of being reversed. And of course, there are other worse problems down the road if we continue on the current trajectory. Now, I wanted to show you tonight just a few things that have been happening in climate science in the past couple of years, because there have been a couple of very interesting developments. The first one is what I would term increased awareness of the importance of the warming Arctic. And I show you that because if you think of even September of last year, the summer sea ice reached a really low level in September of last year. It was the second lowest on record. You could have sailed from Cork quite happily in September all the way around to Japan or China. You could have sailed also even through the Northwest Passage to California or to the west coast of the United States in general. Such was the level of sea ice reduction that occurred. And this is the current state of play as of yesterday. The blue line is showing, of course, we're now beginning to see the first signs of sea ice melting again this year. But you can see that blue line is below the average, below the worst case even of 2012, really for the past 4 months or so. So it augurs very badly for this year in terms of what we're going to see in terms of sea ice. Now, why is that important? Well, as the poles lose their ice and the shiny surface of ice is replaced by a dark ocean surface, it absorbs more heat. And therefore, the temperature of the poles warms up even more. It's a feedback effect. And what this means is that the gradient in temperature between the warm parts of the world at the equator and the cold parts of the world at the poles is reduced. And why that is important is that it's that gradient that drives the westerlies, drives the jet streams. And the bigger the gradient, the colder the poles, the warmer the equator, the bigger that gradient, the stronger the westerlies are. And when we reduce that, making the poles warmer, the westerlies begin to weaken and wobble. And it's that weakening and wobbling we now believe gives rise to more extremes of heat moving north, heat waves in places we never had them, and occasionally the cold snaps becoming more common as well. We're in the middle of one at the moment, of course, but there are signs that the jet stream has weakened and meanders more. And that's a really important frontier of research at the moment to establish that for certain. The second thing that's worth mentioning here is the extreme events. Now, I've been plagued all through my career by every extreme event that occurs in Ireland. Somebody will phone up and say, is this climate change? And I've always had to say, well, it's the kind of thing we would expect to become more common, but we can't attribute a particular event to climate change because it's occurred in the past, because it may be a combination of other factors that's involved. I don't say that anymore, because we now have made a bit of a breakthrough in terms of linking individual events to climate change. And that has come about because we can now run our computer models not once, but run them maybe 100 times. Such has been the power of computing, that we can say, let's run that model 50 times with ordinary pre-industrial levels of CO2, and let's run it 50 times with the current levels of CO2. How often does that extreme event now occur? And that gives us a capability for what we call attribution. So for a heat wave in France, for example, in 2019, we can now begin to say that was 10 times more probable as a result of what we've been doing to the atmosphere than it would have been otherwise. And this has been a very powerful policy instrument and will become even more powerful in the years ahead to persuade decision makers to act on such data and control climate change more. I wanted to show you this other example from this year, well, from last year, from last summer. And it's a place a long way away from here in northern Siberia called Verkhoyansk. And I used to teach my students, generations of students, about Verkhoyansk being the classical continental regime. Because it's so far away from the ocean, the winters were bitterly cold, -50 on average in January. The summers were short and warmer than Irish summers because of that continentality. It's not that far from the pole if you look at it, and yet last summer it hit 38 degrees centigrade. That's something we've never experienced in Ireland, even although we're much, much further south and much more mild, if you like, in terms of our climate. So for a place that this is where you bring your milk home in this fashion, to a place which is 38 degrees centigrade, it's something that's quite unusual. And again, using that attribution model, we now can say that it was perhaps 600 times more likely to have occurred as a result of climate change. And that's getting pretty close to being definitive about the whole thing. So those areas of warmth in the poles mean that those routes that we formerly avoided around the polar seas are now becoming chock-a-block with ships during the summer. There were something like 448 voyages in August alone going around the northern side of Siberia to Japan and China. This is going to be the contested area for the future, sovereignty-wise. And that warmth also meant that a strange thing happened this year, in that this part of northern Siberia, which normally freezes very early in the autumn, didn't freeze at all until well into winter. So things are happening that are unusual. My third point here is that, well, we now can also say with more certainty what the ultimate effect of doubling carbon dioxide is in terms of temperature, because that drives and conditions climate models. And for a long time, people searched what the answer to that question was. Each of these names is a study. And you can see most of them said, well, if you double carbon dioxide, you're going to get a warming of between 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. We're not awfully sure whereabouts that's going to be. And so you got some skeptics, largely skeptics, who said, oh, no, it'll only be about 1 degree, it'll only be tiny. And this was often used by skeptics for many years to disparage modeling attempts. However, we now have made a breakthrough in this, that we're going to be much more sure of where that range is, and it's going to be narrowed considerably in the next IPCC report. You can see some of the skeptics here, or not skeptics, but if you like, people who don't agree with current climate science, suggesting it's as low as 1 degree, even though we've warmed by 1.2 degrees at the moment. So that kind of thing has moved on, and I'll move quickly on from there. But where are we in Ireland? Well, we now know that in Ireland we've warmed by 0.65 degrees over the period from 1961 to 90. So we're well on track to follow the global average. You can see how, as a mid-latitude country, Ireland is generally following the global average with a bit of ups and downs, but we have warmed by 0.65 degrees now in almost every month of the year in Ireland, with all kinds of implications for our growing season and so on. We know it's going to continue. We're getting another ½ degree in the next 20 to 30 years. We know also that the rainfall changes will be our key parameter, with much more winter rain in the west of Ireland and much less rain in the summertime, especially where our people live on the east of Ireland. And that's going to be the big policy crunch, I think, because we have to start planning for flood protection more, and we have to start planning for water supply more in the summer months, where competition for water from people, from agriculture is going to become more intense. But we're seeing already some of the extremes. The wettest winter on record 5-6 years ago. We've seen some mistakes being made, obviously. We've seen also the stormiest winter on record for 143 years in the last decade. We've seen strange things like hurricanes approaching our shores, which were very unusual events and have now become things that we kind of accept will happen more in the future. We had a hurricane making landfall in Portugal this last autumn, for example. And all of this means that we're going to have to be cautious about where we live in terms of our susceptibility to sea level rise. We can map where people are living now, and we can work out how many houses, for example, lie, here's Cork, how many people live 6 meters, 5 meters, 4 meters above sea level in County Cork. And you can see there's maybe nearly 25,000 people living 6 or 7 meters at most above sea level. What happens if they flood? Well, we can start saying how much would they have to claim for insurance. And you can see how even in Cork here, you get up to, with a 3 or 4 meter flood, you get up to 600 or so million euros of a claim very quickly. So there's a cost of doing nothing. And that cost is often not really factored in terms of what protection we build in. Of course, there's a cost in terms of our landscape, in terms of plants that don't like summer drought or don't like higher sea levels, or even plants and animals that might migrate uphill for a while, but ultimately, when they get to the top, have nowhere to go and face extinction. And we have threats, therefore, to a number of our wildlife and biodiversity from those problems. Threats, for example, from warmer waters, for Arctic char in our uplands, threats for species which are partly being decimated by loss of habitat, but climate change is not helping. Indeed, climate change is not helping our salmon species either. And at the same time, we're going to face problems of invasive species which come in, which we don't want. So we have a lot of problems. And to tackle those problems globally, we really need to get our emissions down to net zero by the middle of this century to avoid that 1.5 degree global warming problem. And that's where, of course, the Paris Agreement is designed to achieve that. It means that we have very little time left. If we want to get it down, we want to avoid 1.5 degrees at our current rate of emission, we've only got about a decade left, less than a decade now, if we want a 50-50 chance of avoiding that. If we want a 50-50 chance of avoiding 2 degrees of warming, at which things begin to happen quite quickly, we've only got maybe a couple of decades at most. So we have a problem. And here's where, of course, we move to our current state of play within Ireland. This is where we're at the moment. We have 2020 emission estimates now from the EPA, which are provisional and which have fallen quite considerably due to the pandemic in 2020. But even so, they are still above where we needed to be in terms of our international obligations that we made to our fellow EU partners way back in 2007. So we're a long way away from that. And the climate change bill, of course, is the first attempt to put into the statute books requirements and compulsory requirements for meeting those emission reductions. Now, the first draft of that bill was not a good draft. It was loose. It was very much more concerned with protecting the government from litigation, in my view, than it was from actually tackling the problem of emissions reduction. But I have to say that the improvement of that bill has been very considerable, with the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Change taking many of the recommendations on board that were recommended by the witnesses at those Joint Oireachtas committees in terms of improving it. So we now have an improved bill, and the improved bill is based, quite rightly, on the programme for government, which was established before the government took office. But there's an amazing, there's a problem which I actually only discovered when I started writing this, this particular conference paper for you, and that it comes in the phraseology of the new bill. And it comes in the way they define the so-called reduction that was designed to achieve the programme for governments. And it says the first two carbon budgets shall provide for a reduction of 51% in the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions over the course of the first two budget periods ending on December 2030 from the annual greenhouse gas emissions reported for the year as set out in the National Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory. That looks good if you read it quickly, but if you set your legal mind to work on it, firstly, there's an issue in terms of what year do you choose to start from. If you start from 2018, as the Act says, then you're starting from a baseline of 60.93 million tonnes. Within the next 2 weeks, the EPA will publish the 2019 figures, which will be lower than that. And of course, in 2020, the provisional figures are lower still. But these are relatively minor problems compared to the language, because let's look at what this means. 10 years at the 2018 figures gives you 609.3 million tonnes of emissions for your total emissions on a business as usual scenario. The bill requires this to be reduced by 51%. Right. So the carbon budget for Ireland for the next 10 years, therefore, is going to be around 300 million tonnes. That seems to me to be the literal interpretation of the bill. But is it? If you say 300 million tonnes is your carbon budget, you start applying that year by year. Even if you put twice as much into the first 5 years as the second 5 years, it becomes very difficult to actually achieve that 300 million tonnes. You can see that, you know, if you put more into the second half of the carbon budget, the second 5 years, you have to make even more draconian cuts in the first 5 years. And even the doubling that I've got here still takes you down to 30 million tonnes a year from our current value of 60. That is a big reduction in 5 years. So there's a big problem, I think, in actually attaining that, if we interpret that phrase as meaning that. Now, there are others who have worked on this, and I think of Brian O'Gallagher in UCC in particular, has simply drawn a line from the 2021 figure to the 2030 figure and worked out the carbon budgets as being the sum of the areas inside those lines, giving us a budget of 422 million tonnes for the 10-year two carbon budgets. And that's okay. You can probably get away with that if you tailor it by around about a 3 million tonne reduction each year. You can just about make it, but it still is quite an ask if you do that. But I think the bill is very ambiguous, and we have to really, I mean, I'm going to write to the three-party leaders, I suspect, on Monday to try and get the wording of that bill in Section 5 changed, because it's going to cause legal complications if we don't. Now, in terms of delivering that carbon budget, there's not a lot of scope. This would be the climate action plan from last year before the current government took office. And it was forecasting for a 3% per annum reduction, you know, quite big reductions in electricity and transport in the built environment. In other words, if you want to now go to 7% per year, there's not a lot of scope here for going further. Your scope is only going to come maybe in enterprise, but certainly in agriculture. So it's difficult to see how you can get the kind of reductions that we mentioned a moment ago without tackling ruthlessly, and I hate to say the word, the emissions from livestock agriculture. And that's going to be the big issue for the sectoral allocation, which will follow the carbon budget allocation from the Climate Advisory Council later this year. Is agriculture going to be able to deliver that? Well, the projections at the moment from Teagasc do not suggest that. They are projecting another couple of 100,000 more cows in the next 7 years, that milk output will go up by 19%, and that the average herd size will be about 100. So it's difficult to see that ship being turned around, but I think it's nevertheless going to be important. And I'm nearly there, but I just wanted to leave you with, in a sense, what is quite clear to me, and maybe you'll disagree, but there is, I think, in this statement, I think the kernel of the problem, that the problem of eternal growth, the problem of continual growth, material growth of economies, is a driving force, is a momentum, which is creating and escalating the problem of climate change. And it's slowing down the ability that we have to find solutions to it. It is, of course, to return to my theme before, a question of equity, a question of justice, a question of how much we want to leave to the next generation in terms of options for the future. And that has begun to dawn on people big time in the last few years. We've seen our young people in particular grasp the nettle on this in a way which old fogies like me tried and failed to do. And I think this is the great, I suppose, hope we have for the future, that the clear vision of our young people will effect the change that's going to be necessary. And this is finally then a statement which you don't see from the IPCC normally. It's normally a very conservative body. And here they're saying stuff that's quite radical. Every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, every choice matters. And it's scientifically accurate, as well as bringing home to us the severity of the challenge that we face for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John. That was really, really interesting. There's been quite a lot of chatter in the chat group, John, and quite a few questions for you. So what I might suggest is to try and get through maybe 6 or 7 questions before we go to the next speaker. I might keep the answers brief to about a minute or two. And what you were mentioning there about sometimes you don't often see that simple message from the IPCC before, every decision matters, that last slide that you showed from the IPCC. I might start with that question from Denise Cahill, who is asking about climate scientists and the way that they seem to struggle sometimes to get their message of the urgency and the changes required across, especially to politicians and to key agencies and citizens. So Denise is asking, how can we get scientists to translate their knowledge in an accessible way to the people who need to hear it and act on it?
It's a very good question, and it's one that's troubled me a lot over many years, because scientists in general are lousy communicators. We simply do our stuff in the lab or on the computer. We write our papers and get promoted by doing that. There's no real incentive for most academics to actually go and communicate the message. They're also not very good communicators. And one of the things that I've noticed is that, I dread going on with a skeptic, because a skeptic tears me apart very quickly, because they're often not scientists at all, but they're very articulate, and they're brought up in a tradition of debating, of arguing, of tossing around ideas in a way that, the average scientist, the average nerd doesn't know. So, that's a problem that we have to tackle, and we have to somehow, I think, incentivize scientists to make them communicate with the public better, to disseminate their knowledge. Now, I know the EU does encourage that with all new EU projects, for example, but it is something that we have to try and get around. There are a few very, very good communicators, especially in North America, and they are, of course, targeted by skeptics because of that. But I think it's a very good question that we really have to somehow or other get over. Okay.
Thanks, John. It struck me quite often when we do have stories about climate change science in the media that often the opposing view is the agricultural one, particularly in Ireland. And Dan Boyle has a question about that. He's asking about methane in particular, and in fact, and the fact that globally methane is the greenhouse gas that's growing quickest in intensity. And given the higher makeup of methane in Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions, he's asking, how can we face down agribusiness in Ireland? What's your view on that?
Well, that's the $64 question. Methane is a gas which is 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So to reduce a ton of methane is enormously more helpful in terms of slowing global warming than to reduce a ton of CO2. Ireland is unique together with New Zealand, we are the two countries with the highest methane emissions per capita in the world. And here I think I have a great deal of sympathy for our farmers, because our farmers are generally good people who know exactly what's changing around them. They are very sensitive about looking after the landscape and looking after the soil. But agribusiness is what Dan is mentioning there. And I think agribusiness is the problem, because the profit motive drives more and more intensity to occur in agriculture at the moment in Ireland. And that is not really benefiting our farmers very much. They don't make much better living now than they did 20 years ago. The real profits are made by the fat cats who have their couple of million for their CEO every year. And I think we have to simply lead farmers better than they're being led at the moment. The farming community, I think, is in danger of being led into a cul-de-sac, because these changes are coming. And I really want farmers to be aware of the fact that now is the time to adapt. Now is the time to diversify. Now is the time to get away from the intensification rat race and do the things that you know will be much more productive in the long term. But Dan is asking a very hard question. How do we stand up to the people with unlimited pockets? And that's not an easy one. There are challenges you can make legally. And I'm very conscious of the fact that, for example, some countries like Holland have stood up to the intensification process and have told their agribusiness, go elsewhere. Don't expect to get permission to intensify further in our country. And by go elsewhere, I just hope that doesn't mean go to Ireland.
Thanks, John. In terms of what Ireland's doing, Anna Ahern had a question in the chat where she was quoting Colin McCarthy in the Irish Times, and he was saying that Ireland doesn't have its own atmosphere, so our target of having our emissions over the next decade is going to fail if others aren't doing the same thing. So Anna was wondering what you thought about that, and there was another comment in the chat on that by Frank Dorr, who compared it a little bit to World War I, where each platoon had to defend its own little patch, or otherwise the whole line would break. So is it comparable maybe to something like that?
Well, it's a question of, it's what in my Scottish twang I would call whataboutery. And it's often used to say, well, what about the Chinese? They're building coal-fired power stations 10 a penny. What about the Americans? They've gone off the Paris Agreement. Maybe they're back now, of course. And I think we also have to say to ourselves, well, if we're not prepared to stand up and accept our own personal responsibility for our actions, we can't expect other countries and other places to do it otherwise. If you walk down the main street of Cork and you say to yourself, well, my crisp packet's not going to make a big difference if I throw it on the ground here. There's lots of other ones. People are doing the same thing. That leads ultimately to collective disaster. You're right, we're dealing with a common resource, the atmosphere. And a common resource with free access, with no utilization charges, is a resource ultimately that gets misused. It's rather like the tragedy of the commons on a big scale, where you might have a common pasture that can be accessed by anybody. So I think we have to stand up and do our own bit, irrespective of what others are doing, and we have to accept the responsibilities that unless we do our own bit, we're adding to the burden that I mentioned already for other countries on a grand scale. So there's no use pointing the finger at anybody else. We have to act responsibly as responsible citizens.
So we've talked about climate change, science communications and agriculture and what Ireland can do, and methane. One thing we haven't mentioned yet is fossil fuels, but there were a few questions about that. I'll take two of them. John Leahy was asking about your view on the decision of the government to cease issuing licenses for oil and gas exploration off our coasts. And then there was another question about your view of the CETA, this trade agreement between Canada and Europe, and fossil fuel subsidies.
Okay. Oh, they're hard questions tonight, all right. Well, let me just say that the fossil fuel age is over. It's coming to an end very quickly. And let me say also that the Stone Age ended. And the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The Stone Age ended because we moved on to something technologically better. And the fossil fuel age will end for the same reason. I think we have to bite the bullet here and accept that we...
Yeah, that's a pity now. We've just missed John just as we were learning that the fossil fuel age is ending just like the Stone Age ended, and hurrah to that. I'm not sure if we can get John back. We'll just wait a few seconds, but otherwise I know our other two speakers are almost ready to go. And John had already mentioned one of them, a teenage activist. So we'll be going over to you, Amy, if you want to get ready, and I'll just give it another about 10 seconds to see if we can get John back. You might give me a signal, Alan, if he does seem like he's able to come back. Okay. Yeah, it looks like we've lost him. That's a pity. But we were just almost on to our last question with John anyway. So the last thing I wanted to ask him was, somebody was asking about the Citizens' Assembly and the Citizens' Assembly recommendation on tackling the Irish biodiversity emergency. This was in the context of the 2019 declaration of a climate and biodiversity emergency. And the question was whether or not Professor Sweeney would be prepared to chair that forum if the Taoiseach asked him. So I thought that was a nice one to end in. I think John's talk was really, really interesting. I've learned so much just from those few minutes, and certainly if it's a great way to communicate climate change science. So what I might do then is introduce our next speaker, Amy O'Brien. John was pointing out that you know, there's been such a movement that even a lot of people who've been involved in the climate change awareness and activism over the past couple of decades didn't seem to be able to sort of inject that sense of urgency that about 2 or 3 years ago teenagers started injecting. And in particular, Greta Thunberg and her Fridays for Future and school protests. So we're delighted now tonight to have a 15-year-old climate activist with her. Amy describes herself as a climate activist, a writer, and a feminist. She's managed to continue raising awareness of climate change despite all the challenges of the last year. And she also hosts a podcast on the Sustainable Development Goals and is co-chair of the Cork County Corlin and Oak. So tonight she's going to talk to us about climate change, and the title of her talk is called Faster and Fairer. So Amy, if you're ready, I might transfer over to you now.
Yeah, okay. Hello everyone. So I just want to say thank you to John first. I know he's gone, but it's important to me to try and understand the science more all the time, as should all of us. And that was a really, really informative way of doing it. Now I won't directly be talking to you about science, but I'll get on with my speech. So thank you for having me here tonight. And I recognize that my speech may be different to everyone else's. Yeah, so unlike other speeches here tonight, I'm an activist and I'm still in school. And I won't pretend to have all the answers, but the answer I do have is climate justice. So I'm Amy O'Brien and I'm a 15-year-old climate activist, feminist and student. The main thing I worry about almost every day is climate change. It's devastating communities already, and the time to avert the worst possible future is running out. My friends abroad are already at risk and my future is at risk. So I'm a climate activist because I feel I have to be. Education is a vital part of fighting this crisis, because without somewhat understanding the science, listening to stories of those impacted and how to move forward in a sustainable way, I probably wouldn't care, and how else could we expect everyone else to? My One Future group has helped me to stay updated on trade deals, climate bills, and agriculture policies that I probably wouldn't even have knowledge of otherwise. They are a support of people offering resources and helping me become better equipped. One Future covers the local climate news that, like, education in schools tends to miss. So in school, climate education is touched on, but only in terms of, understanding that greenhouse gases trap heat, and you don't learn about the suffering and how it's impacting people and how it will impact us, which is what makes people care about the climate crisis. So to not educate yourself on the climate crisis really is a form of privilege that we all have. That the climate crisis is not yet imminent, but it is in other countries. And we need to use the undeniable privilege that we all have, even though we have different experiences, to fight with and not for them. We need climate education to come together and fight this fight. That's how I came up with the Everyone's Climate mailing list for people in my town, because even when people want to, they don't know where to look for information on the climate and biodiversity crisis if they feel that they're somewhat outside of it. And that's not, we need everyone in this fight. That's not the way it should be. So I always would have sent emails, but I only ever lobbied to these thanks to One Future. And within the group, someone sets up a Zoom, and it's very normalized to tell the policymakers what you think needs to happen. So actually the first time I heard about them was the National TD Lobby, which is in December. And I was amazed at the coordinated, lobby of so many people and regular people, and like me, that brought around change. And we were from different groups, different activism groups, and we didn't have to be, well versed on every part of climate change, but we knew that there was change, and we came together for that. And this is to raise our concerns around the amended climate bill. And quite frankly, it was a worrying bill. I think that was important because, it just showed to me that we all need to come together in this. We can't just leave it to politicians, because at the end of the day, they're responding to what we've been telling them. So now the bill has been amended, and we are looking at a hugely improved one, and it's a step forward. It was still problematic, and John went into that, but it doesn't account for our fair share. So I'm also a Fridays for Future activist, as many of you would probably have guessed, and I'm actually more involved in that group. But we want real zero, not net zero, much sooner than 2050, along with real accountability. So targets are important, but the plan, the trajectory is almost more important, because that sets out our actions for the next month, years, 5 years ahead, which is the most crucial time to act. But this clear insight with One Future into how I could be part of really changing something was a turning point in my activism journey. They hold webinars and send out all kinds of things to explain these bills and action plans. And the government wants us to say that this plan is brilliant and ambitious, but warming above 1.5 degrees is an ambitious risk. We will not settle because we can't compromise with the science. That's not a choice. Our line is faster, fairer climate change. That sums up everything we're fighting for together, and it is the name of this speech. We need to support everyone to be able to afford the change. Climate change is not just an environmental issue, it is a social issue, in that it is a racial and gender issue. It is an equality issue. Stop worrying about your profits and the economy. This is so much more worrying. This is terrifying. The fight against climate change is the fight for climate justice, which means that no one is left behind in Ireland or, crucially, anywhere else on Earth. We are at around 1.2 degrees warming, and my friends who are activists in MAPA, and if you're not a Fridays for Future activist, which most of you probably aren't, that means most affected people and areas. They are suffering the consequences already, even though they contributed the least and are far less able to adapt. We are fighting for 1.5 so that I can have a livable future and they can have a future. So when scientists say that 1.5 may not be possible, because we are still not taking action, and the Paris Agreement commits to below 2 degrees. That means I'm fighting for just a salvaged way of living for our future. I'm no longer able to fight for a better world. MAPA has never been voiceless, but they have been silenced. So like every other day, today we need to uplift their voices. Listen to the science, but also listen to the people. Remember that activists, and particularly young people, are the ones fighting for 1.5, not politicians, not corporations, not banks. They're responding to our demands, and we need to continue to demand more, because the possibility to stay below 1.5 is slim, and it requires us to act now. Here's a quote from Mitzi Janelle Tan in the Philippines at MOCOP, which was a version of COP26 that young people held when it was postponed last year. Again, we recognize more than world leaders how time-sensitive climate action is. Anyway, here's a quote. How are leaders, especially those in the global north, supposed to make climate policies when they've most probably never truly experienced and understood the urgency of the climate crisis we are living? I have such vivid memories of staying in the dark, having to eat dinner by the candlelight because there is no electricity, because there's a raging storm outside, sitting down in my room cold and afraid that a tree might just fall on our house through our roof, having to wake up in the middle of the night to scoop out floodwater that's entering our room and our house. This is our reality. Some people label climate activists as alarmists, but reality is alarming. Stop excluding Indigenous people. Nature is our solution, and the companies we are investing in as developed countries are murdering these people for blood code. They're killing the planet that can save us, and pretending we are the only species by causing the extinction of over 100 a day. We need ecosystems. We cannot survive on cities alone. And our lands may be out of sight. Maybe the damage that we're seeing may be out of sight, but that does not mean that they can be left out of mind. Sustainability is key in every way to how we move forward, but only if we include intersectionality, not as a word or commitment, but as constant actions. That includes all countries, all sexualities, all genders, all body types, and all ages. One future is intergenerational, because this planet only survives if we are intergenerational. I know that many of you will be surprised that I am my age giving this speech, but I am. I'm just after finishing recording the podcast I'm hosting. There's the mic. And I just wanted to point this out to show it once again that young people have a voice and we need to be heard. Not only that, we need to be listened to. You know, I wish I didn't have to be here and that climate change didn't have to consume my life, but this is the world we are living in and we will not settle. We need everyone to save this planet, and we need everyone to be able to save this planet. We need everyone to do their bit, but we also need system change. We need climate action and just transition. So we are fighting for the future, but we are fighting for today as well. I'm still pleading for the same thing I've been begging for with years, because it's the only option. Climate justice now. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thanks so much, Amy. Amy, I'm going to go straight to Caitríona, and then I'll take questions and answers for both of you, if that's okay, when Caitríona's finished. But I already have a few things that we want to ask you around your talk, particularly this idea that it needs to involve everyone across all genders, across all minorities. I think that's so interesting. This is a social movement, not just an environmental movement. So thanks so much, Amy. Caitríona, I'll go straight on to you if you want to turn on your microphone there. And I think John Sweeney is back in the call as well. John, thanks for joining us again. If we have time, John, at the end, I might just bring you in for one question before you leave at the end, if you have time. If not, thanks so much for joining us this evening. But to move to our last speaker tonight, who's Caitríona Courtney, who's the manager of the Northside Community Enterprises Energy Hub. And the Northside Community Enterprises, or NCE, is a community energy support office, and they help homes and businesses and communities to become more energy efficient, to reduce their energy bills, and to move towards a low carbon future. And Caitríona's also involved in setting up a new paint reuse circular economy scheme at NCE. She has a master's in architecture from UCC, and she's worked as an architect in Cork and Limerick before joining NCE, and is now also a director of Cork Environmental Forum. So tonight she'll be speaking to us about NCE supporting communities with residential retrofitting projects. So Caitríona, if your mic is open, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here tonight. It was great to hear so from John about setting the context, and then I suppose to hear the scale of the ambition then as well from Amy, I suppose that we all really need to act on. So tonight, I suppose I'd just like to talk to you a bit about some of the residential retrofitting projects we've been involved in. So just, I suppose, to give you a bit of background on Northside Community Enterprises, where I work, set up, I suppose, to provide education and training to people to serve the needs of the local community. And I suppose to achieve this mission, NCE set up a number of different social enterprises, and the Energy Hub and NCE Installation is one of those. So NCE Installation was set up in 2003 to address the needs of the elderly and the fuel poor in the community. And I suppose also to provide employment opportunities for people who are long-term unemployed. So we were providing training in installing attic and cavity wall insulation. And I suppose over the years then NCE has been continually developing. And I suppose key area here is that we work in partnership with numerous other community-based organisations, local authorities and SMEs across Ireland, I suppose, to deliver energy-saving projects. And then in 2018, we opened the Energy Hub. So that is, I suppose, as Rachel mentioned, it's a community energy support office. So we're there to help provide clear paths and support for people, or communities or businesses when it comes to energy efficiency upgrades. I suppose we're there to provide advice and help people find suitable contractors, BER assessors, advise people on what grants are available, and then guide them through that process. I suppose just before we get into some of the projects, I kind of just wanted to set the context for energy use in the residential sector in Ireland. So it's quite significant. 23% of energy use in Ireland is used in the residential sector. So it's the second largest energy user per sector. And then when you break that down in the home, we see that 60% of our energy requirement is actually used for heating our homes. And then so 19% then for our water heating. So I suppose you can kind of see there the need for us and why we need to retrofit so many of our houses in Ireland, because unfortunately they're just really energy inefficient at the moment. And so I suppose then we're also looking at the targets that were set in the Climate Action Plan, which was to retrofit 500,000 houses to a B2 energy rating by 2030, which is also, I suppose, quite a large number. So just to give you a sample of some of the projects we're working in, one of them is the SEAI's Better Energy Warmer Home Scheme. So this is a scheme that provides free energy efficiency upgrades for people who are in receipt of specific social welfare payments. So NCE Installation is a procured contractor on this panel. And I suppose it's really to tackle homes for people who are living in fuel poverty. So there's around 25% of households in Ireland are living in fuel poverty. So it's quite a big issue in Ireland. So to date, since 2017, we have retrofitted over 903 houses around Ireland. And that again is working with a number of different contractors all around Ireland. And community-based organisations, I suppose, to deliver on those houses. And I suppose there are so many other benefits as well to this retrofitting, such as, I suppose, social inclusion. You know, these people couldn't have afforded this retrofitting without the government support. It's helping take people out of energy poverty, so they're reducing their energy bills, as well as reducing CO2 emissions. And then obviously there's the increased well-being, I suppose, both mentally and physically as well. So then another scheme that we work across is the Community Energy Grant, which is another scheme under the SEAI. And so this is a program designed to bring communities together to achieve large-scale energy savings across a range of projects. So there will be all different energy users part of these schemes. So for instance, community building, as you can see in the top left-hand corner, that's a community-run swimming pool down in Baltimore. Public buildings such as Ballybolan Fire Station, you'll have commercial buildings, then residential as well, such as social housing, private homeowners and housing associations. And so it's really to support all these, bringing these different energy users in the community together. Then the types of, I suppose, supports that are available for that is to, I suppose, primarily retrofit the building fabric. So I suppose that is the number one area we need to tackle, is we need to, I suppose, make our buildings more energy efficient by installing, I suppose, insulation and then looking at windows and doors as well. And then it also supports renewable energy, so installing heat pumps and photovoltaic panels for generating electricity, as well as innovative technologies. And I suppose just specifically for the residential sector, there are a variety of different grant levels available depending on the house type. So it ranges from 35% up to 80% for people who would be in receipt of certain social welfare payments. So just to show you an example of one of these community retrofitting residential projects. So this is Harbourview Road up in Knocknaheeny in Cork. So this project was really driven by the local residents association on Harbourview Road. There was a number of different regeneration projects taking place around Knocknaheeny, and I suppose these residents wanted to be part of a project as well. They're a really well-established community. The houses were built in around the 1960s. So a really strong community here who had been living there for quite a while. So I suppose this was a collaborative project between Cork City Council. There was a number, I suppose, a split between a mix of social and private homes along this road. NCE Insulation were the lead applicant, applying for the funding to the SEAI. SE Systems were the main contractor on this job, and then we got grant support from the SEAI. So there was 76 houses on this road. We did a pilot in 2018 of 6 homes, and then the remainder 70 were carried out in 2019. So I suppose it was a challenging project in that all of the residents remained in their homes while the works were being carried out. SE Systems, I suppose, had a tenant liaison officer up there the whole time, I suppose, working in participation with the residents so that everybody knew what was going on. Planning works, I suppose each house was unique, and especially when you were, I suppose, working with some elderly homeowners as well, who may have different health conditions, etc. I suppose each approach was slightly different in every house. So here you can just see some of the photos. So there was external wall insulation installed. A lot of the windows and doors were upgraded. They got heat pumps installed, PV systems, as well as attic insulation, some internal dry lining as well on the slope ceilings. And those houses started off at an E2 building energy rating. And then they ended up between B1 and A3 energy rating after the works were completed. So there was 59% energy savings across all those houses. And so I suppose some of the benefits we saw here is that, I think as John mentioned, is that we don't see the CO2 emissions. And equally, when you're talking to residents and homeowners, it's not something that people are talking about as well afterwards. When you're talking to people, they're telling you about, I suppose, the benefits of they're now seeing reduced energy bills. It's that enhanced pride in their community and in their road. There's, I suppose, how different their houses are to live in now. They're extremely comfortable and warm. You know, issues with mold and dampness is gone. So there's just so many other benefits to these projects, as well as reducing your CO2 emissions. And so then, I suppose just lastly to mention, the cost of retrofitting is quite significant, and we are going to need a variety of different, I suppose, financial solutions to tackle this and to, I suppose, upgrade all of our homes. I suppose we are working on one solution, and it's a collaborative project started off with Caitríona Courtney Credit Union. So we want to develop Energy Union. So it's, I suppose, a one-stop shop retrofitting package for homeowners, whereby the credit unions will provide a low interest rate loan, and then the Energy Hub will help provide link homeowners up with BR assessors, contractors, and take care of the grants as well. So we have 8 credit unions on board. This was launched just at the end of 2019, and I suppose just as we were getting going, we hit the pandemic, so we're hoping to relaunch this again soon. But I suppose the whole idea here is to make life as easy as possible for homeowners, that when you apply that, I suppose that we will assist you with finding contractors, BR assessors, help with the grants, and then there is I suppose a lower interest rate loan available then through your local credit union. So that's just one sample of where we need to go, but we do need a variety of different financing models going forward as well. So that is it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Caitríona. There's 1 or 2 questions in the chat for you, Caitríona, but I just want to say to John Sweeney, John, I'm sorry we lost you there just as we were in the Q&A, and thanks for joining in again. I know you have to leave in the next minute or two, so if you want to just make your parting remarks. The other thing is, John, maybe if you just want to, as you're leaving, just address this idea that Caitríona and Amy both had, that really climate justice is social justice. This is a social issue as much as a scientific and geographical one.
I was just going to say that Amy and Maria both hit the nail very much on the head there in terms of the issue being a social and justice issue, because we hear a great deal about the economics of climate change. We're hit by macroeconomic decision making, we're hit by marginal cost abatement curves, and we're given the impression that, you know, climate change is something we can't afford to tackle. And I think what was said there is really very true, that it's no longer simply an issue of economics, it's an issue of justice, it's an issue of ethics, it's an issue of morality. And I think that's very important to get across, because it's now transcended the kind of normal run-of-the-mill problems that we've tackled before. And I think what they were saying there kind of epitomizes it. I mean, Amy spoke very forcefully about the issue of intergenerational equity, for example, which I think is a key in terms of mobilizing public opinion, but mobilizing decision makers. But I think the economics paradigm that we've become so used to hearing is no longer the paramount one we should be worried about in this issue.
Thanks so much, John. Amy, I don't know if you want to come in on that. You were saying during your talk, Amy, that we should stop worrying about profits and the economy, because climate change is much more worrying than that. That seems logical and reasonable, but for some reason older generations just don't seem to get it. Is that something that you talk about in your group, or do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, we just completely believe people before profit. It sounds fundamental. It sounds like it just makes sense that you would put people's survival and the planet's survival before making more money. But we've seen that no matter how much you say that, that isn't the case. You know, in Fridays for Future International, which I'm involved with, we're part of the Standard Chartered Bank campaign, which is one of the biggest banks in the UK, where COP26 is going to be hopefully this year. And you know, like instead of like answering our questions, our demands, Bill Winters, the CEO, they started banning us from Twitter, as in silencing our tweets. I don't even know how you do that, but they're big corporations and they can do that. And yeah, it is something we talk about, but more than anything, we talk about climate justice because it is the only way. I don't think we can even get into that mindset because we just can't understand how you couldn't push the actual survival of everyone here today, all the people who are dying, people I talk to every day who are dying in other countries. We had a call today with IPCC scientists about 1.5, and straight after the science, we always have MAPA voices giving their input on how like their own family members are dying. And I think if companies could hear that, I really would hope, because I think they have been told, but I really would hope that they would change immediately. And yeah, I just think it is something we talk about, but more than anything, we talk about climate justice as an entire systemic change, and it's people over profit.
Can I just add to what Amy is saying there, because there is one very important issue that I think she raises there. Companies will listen to people who have money. And, I think we do need to look at where our investments are going. There is a very good movement now going around the world of divestment, especially from fossil fuel investment sources. And I would urge everybody here tonight, look at your pensions, look at your unit trusts, look at what they are investing in, and raise the issue with your financial advisors if you have investments that you think are not ethical in terms of climate change, because a huge amount of money is flowing out of many of these investments now when people suddenly realize that they're subsidizing the wrong thing.
Thanks, John. Amy, I just have one other question before I go to two questions for you, Caitríona. You mentioned, Amy, about the all genders, the all minorities. And I know when we were doing our global training in climate reality last year, Al Gore talked a lot about the planet being at a sort of an intersection of the climate change crisis, the Black Lives Matter crisis, and the COVID crisis, all sort of joining at the same time, and perhaps this becoming an opportunity to really change things. So do you want to talk a little bit about what you mean by complete systematic change? What would that look like?
Yeah, funny enough, that was actually the question I asked our podcast guest tonight. But basically, I think that, you look at all these issues, and I'm in, anti-racism groups, Youth Against Racism Ireland, if you want to look at like their Instagram or anything. We had a protest yesterday, but I'm in feminism, I'm in, climate action. Obviously, we're all trying to stay safe at the moment in the public health crisis, but these are all different problems, but there has to be a link. You have to see that there is a link, that in the system, and this goes back to my last point, in the system we're living in, we are putting people over profit, and it's happening over and over again. And it's, it's the same problem that in underdeveloped countries, they're not poor, they're not inherently poor. They're rich in resources, and they are being exploited by us in the developed world. And it's the same. We're not only exploiting resources, we're exploiting people as well. And that's the problem under this system. So I suppose in terms of what system change means to me, it means putting people first, because again, that is so fundamental. That sounds like such a simple, easy thing, but really we're so far from that right now. And that is what needs to happen. That's where all of our problems stem from, but it's also where all our solutions will stem from. And all these protests I'm involved in, they're like trickling into what really needs to be an entire reform. And I know that that's not what like our politicians tend to be into, entire big, systemic changes, but that's what we need. We need people over profit, and all our other problems are stemming, but can also be solved from that.
Super, thanks, Amy. Caitríona, I might come to you because there were two questions in the chat that I just wanted to bring to you. They're practical ones. One is asking, how long does it take before the energy savings pay for the loan that you might need to do the the retrofit and the energy efficiency. And then there was another question, just if you maybe weren't so good online or didn't have access maybe to online and you wanted to contact somebody maybe by phone or have a brochure, is there anything like that that NCE offers?
Yes, absolutely. I'll put our phone number in the chat below. I'd say that actually the majority of the people who call into us physically when we were open were, I suppose, people who wouldn't be using the internet or wouldn't be comfortable using the internet, and so we would help people fill out forms or give them information and go through all of that with them, or just provide advice. So we can do that over the phone now, and I can send out information as well. I'll put my details down below. That's no problem at all. And absolutely anyone can get in contact with us at any stage. We'll try to help. In terms of the how much or how long it takes to pay back the loans, I suppose I don't have a straight answer for that. I suppose because the prices vary so much between each job. So you could have, depending, like if you're getting a deep retrofit on your house, depending on the size, the age of the house, the quality, you could be paying anywhere from 10,000 to, it could be up to 100,000, if you have quite a large house out in the countryside. It really varies. But so I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately, but I'm happy to take a bit. If he has an idea for how much it would cost, I can get back to you and let you know how much that would be roughly on average.
Thanks, Caitríona.
Yeah, sorry that I can't give you a concrete answer there, but I am happy to find out if I have, I suppose, the figures.
No problem. And you put the number there in the chat. Just one other question, Caitríona, and we might finish with this one. I was listening to Eamon Ryan earlier this morning on, I think he was on RTE radio, and he was talking a good 10 or 15 minutes about climate change and bills and action plans and the rest of it. But he just mentioned one line where he was asked about €10 flights to the sun, how, and are they going to be a thing of the past? And he just mentioned in passing, yes, €10 flights to the sun will have to become a thing of the past, and that he was working on that. And almost immediately it was the headline on one of the national broadsheets, that the minister said €10 flights are a thing of the past. And that has typically been a problem with climate change communication, hasn't it? That it sounds expensive sometimes to make these changes. So how does NCE go about showing the benefit, the financial benefit of making changes?
Quite often it's word of mouth. It's actually people who spread the word rather than us. And I think it has to work by people telling more people. It's, people go in and they experience what it's like to see when their friends or family have had their house retrofitted. That for us, I think, is the biggest driver. Because it's hard to see until you actually experience it, how many benefits there are to this, and people they're just not thinking in terms of, day to day, you're not thinking about, the majority of people aren't thinking about their CO2 emissions. You're thinking about your warmth, your comfort, you're thinking about your energy bills, your health conditions. There's so many different factors at play, but this actually benefits all of these by carrying out these retrofitting projects.
Super, thanks, Caitríona. You're reminding me actually of somebody who told me that their dad lived in quite an old house and was always, it was always very cold and damp. But since he got it insulated, he's running around it in a t-shirt because it's so warm. So definitely, yeah, word of mouth works. And on that warm note, I think we'll bring this evening to a close. Thanks everybody for joining us. Seeing such great numbers on a night like tonight really makes the event for us. So thank you very much for joining. And thanks as well for your engagement on the chat and for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's question, but I hope we answered them to your satisfaction, the ones that we did. Just before we go, you probably already know that Friday Earth Films takes place on the second Friday of every month. And the next talk in that series is going to be on the 14th of May. It's a panel discussion on that date on the topic of biodiversity, and you'll get some information about that by email in the coming week or two. So on behalf of SHEP Earth Aware and on behalf of Cork Environmental Forum, again, thank you for coming. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully we will see you again soon.